Thanks, Brenton. Good evening, everyone, and welcome along to our Bible class on Obadiah this evening. I first, I suppose, got interested in the book of Obadiah when I noticed how short it was. I thought, it's the kind of reading or study you can start and you can finish. But also, I suppose when I first thought about it, I thought, I've never heard anybody give a talk on Obadiah. Now, I'm sure some of you have, but I hadn't. And I think to this day it's true that I've never heard anybody speak on the book of Obadiah. And then I looked at it and I thought, wow, it's pretty savage. It's like many parts of the Old Testament. It feels very negative. It feels very focused on judgment, and maybe understandably so in light of the many injustices that litter the history of the world. But even so, how can we extract something positive and useful from a book like this? So I challenged myself, and I did get into the study. I really enjoyed it as I went through the book of Obadiah. And I found that the more I looked, the more I realised how powerfully it spoke. And even in this shortest book of the Old Testament, tucked away here in the middle of the minor prophets at the end of the Old Testament, I found that God had some important things to say. And I just want to perhaps point you in the direction of some of those that I've discovered tonight. And 5 of the things particularly that I think we should look for as we work our way through Obadiah tonight. First of all is there's a focus in the first few verses on pride. And that reminds us, doesn't it, of one of the great prophetic values that God put in front of Israel, humility. It's one of the great 3 things that in the prophet Micah God requires. And he says, at the centre of my covenant with you, my people, underpinning everything I've asked you to do in the law of Moses, there is justice. There is mercy and there is humility. And so I realised that even though Obadiah focuses on the breach of that value, if you like, in the terms of pride, if we flip the coin and look at the other side of that, then he's got something powerful to say to us about the importance to God of humility and the way in which that affects our relationships with other people. Then you would have noticed as Dan was reading through, there's a section from verses 10 to 14 where Obadiah just catalogues the crimes of Edom, if you like, and he pronounces judgment on Edom for its unbrotherly behaviour. And again, it seems very negative at first reading, but if we adopt the same approach, if we flip the coin and say, well, what's this telling us about what God does want, we realise that he has much to say about brotherly behaviour as well. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. And that means that even when things go wrong for our brothers and sisters, for our fellow men and women, we need to look for ways to help and to play a constructive role in that tragedy. And Obadiah condemns Edom for not doing that, and we'll see how we can learn from that tonight. Then, of course, in the middle of the book, he talks about the day of the Lord coming on all nations. He talks about the blessing and the restoration of Israel, and he finishes by talking about well, it doesn't sound like forgiveness and reconciliation, does it? It sounds like more judgment. But actually we'll see when we look at the way in which Edom's future is interpreted in Scripture. In fact, for Edom too, there is the opportunity for a remnant by grace to be saved by the love of God and to experience forgiveness and perhaps even brotherly reconciliation with Jacob at the end of history. So these were some of the things that I sort of learned to look for in Obadiah. And I suppose in a way it's helped me to reevaluate my attitude to the Old Testament as a whole, because I guess I've learned that when I go to it and find parts of it perhaps a little difficult or a little challenging, if I approach it through the lens of Christ and look for him there and God's revelation of himself in him, then I can find a lot. And so that's really, I found that personally quite helpful, and therefore it's become a little bit of a favourite with me. Now, perhaps a bit of background here. Where is Edom? So this is a sort of a schematic of the land of Israel, if you like. The Dead Sea's here. Up here is the territory of Ammon, and then comes the territory of Moab, and then finally the territory of Edom. So the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites occupied this territory on the east of the Jordan River, and the Edomites were in the south. So this Wadi Hussar is the name today, or the Zered, is a sort of a deep cleft in the mountains, in the plateau here, that comes down to the Dead Sea, and then Edom has sort of the territory south of that. So that's sort of roughly where it is on the map, if you like. And Bozrah is a name you'll come across occasionally in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, and it was the capital of Edom. So what kind of country is it? Well, this was one of the things that I learned, which was quite a sort of a game changer for me, if you like. I guess I'd always understood that the name Edom means red, and that it was the sort of this part of the world, you know, just almost like a moonscape that Edom inhabited. And I guess part of its territory is like this, but what I found, in fact, was that other parts of Edom were quite different again. So this is a picture of that Wadi Zered. If we just go back a couple of steps on the map, you think, you know, here it is coming, the desert's just here, and then there's sort of this short voyage through the mountains, short journey through the mountains, and then here we have the Dead Sea. It's going to be pretty arid and saline, right? Well, think again. The mountains actually capture a lot of rain. The mountains of Edom stand much higher than the mountains of Israel's southern desert, and they capture a lot of rain. Maybe not by our standards, but 10 to 18 inches a year, and certainly enough to live on. And in these valleys, they're quite sort of lush and fertile. So I've included just a few pictures, perhaps to give you a different sense of what Edom perhaps looks like in southern Jordan, of course, it is today. So these photographs reflect the land as it is today. But I think it's a reasonably isolated part of the country, and it's probably not radically different from the way it would have been 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. So this is the village of Dana on the edge of a nature reserve that apparently captures all the 4 sort of ecological zones of Jordan. It was sort of abandoned, but it's being rebuilt now by a conservation foundation. So it's really being restored to what I guess an Edomite village in a way would have looked like years ago. But you can see that even though there's plenty of trees and greenery around, it's a challenging landscape, isn't it? They're perched right here on the edge of the mountains, and the mountains plunge sharply down to these valleys. And then out here, of course, is the flat depression, the south of the Jordan, below the Dead Sea, that winds its way out to the Red Sea eventually as well. So it's not an easy part of the world to live in, and it reflects something of the temperament of the Edomites, if you like. They were tough people, and they were up for hardship, and they were going to make a go of it even in a reasonably forbidding environment. So another part of the same landscape, I suppose, in our terms, it's something like parts of the Flinders Ranges. You know, they look very arid from a distance. When you get close in, there's a lot of life going on, and it's possible to carve out a living there. So an ancient Edomite. This is some olive orchards from one of the towns in the area. So you can see it's quite arable. You know, you can grow the staples, wheat, grapes and olives there, no problem. You just got to harvest the rain and make it work for you, and you can carve out a challenging but in the end comfortable living in a place like that. This is Bozrah itself. You can see this sort of isolated mountain peak here. That is a perfect location for an ancient city, I guess. They sort of perched up on the top. Hasn't really been properly excavated, but that's the ancient capital of Edom. And it gives you some sense of why when Obadiah talks about sort of their pride and their confidence in the way the landscape worked for them. It was isolated, it was rugged, it was easy to fortify, and they felt supremely confident in the place that they lived in. And you can see why when you look at places like that. So it was quite an interesting sort of change in my thinking to see this as a habitable part of the world where you know, people could live quite comfortably from generation to generation if they just made the landscape work for them. It's sort of spread out. If we go back to that map, just back here, it actually doesn't stretch far this way because, as you can imagine, you're pretty quickly into the desert of Arabia. So it's sort of like long and narrow like that, only about 10 or 15 k's wide, but right along the tops of those mountains that catch the rain, that's where Edom is. Sorry to make you give you motion sickness, but so I've got a couple of quotations here. There's a book by, if you love geography, you probably want to get this book. It's by he was a United Nations geographer who worked in the land of Israel in the 50s and the 60s. His name is Dennis Bailey. And just a couple of quotations to give you a feel for Edom. He said, "Here is a region altogether apart, forbidding and inaccessible, the home still of the leopard and such other animals as man in his ferocity has not yet succeeded in destroying. A certain aura of mystery seems to have surrounded the country of Edom. And even today," so he's writing in the 50s and 60s, his work was interrupted, in fact, by the Six-Day War. He lost all of his maps and he had to start all over again to finish his book. So he's writing in that sort of time frame. Even today, he said, these heights have a decided quality of otherness. In Old Testament times, it must have been a strange and somewhat frightening region where the villages and fields coaxed out of the surrounding woodland were exposed alike to the most violent tantrums of the Middle Eastern climate, the onslaught of the desert tribes, and the ever-present menace of wild animals breathing close upon them from the desert, the forest, and the brutal sandstone crags. The winters in Edom, he said, are often icily cold, with howling savage storms and snow that lies along upon the elevated ridge, but the summers are fresh and cool. And he commented on the fact that the heights of Edom were clothed with great forests of pines, oaks, junipers, hawthorns, almonds, and carobs. So you can see it's not that sort of red, arid moonscape that certainly I had associated with Edom in my mind, but quite a livable part of the world. And that's where Esau had carved out a kingdom in this world, and that's where the proud nation of Edom lived. So let's just have a quick overview of their history. I don't want to get into any of this in too much detail because we've just got the one night, and I probably would just want to throw a few lines out if you like, and if you're interested to follow it up, sort of a bit of a teaser for your own thinking and reading later on. So just quickly overviewing on a couple of slides the history of Edom. First of all, if we go right back, what's that, nearly 4,000 years, we've got the family of Isaac living, a large nomadic nation, if you like, in the land of Canaan, and the two sons of Isaac, Esau and Jacob, are competing with each other. Now, we know how that story played out. Esau wanted a kingdom in this world. Jacob was focused on the promises. He was determined to secure them. I'm not going to try and justify his behaviour here tonight, but ultimately Esau wanted this world. Jacob wanted the promise and the fulfilment of the promise in the future. And there was this conflict and competition between the two brothers, a very different temperament, to achieve their respective goals. But interestingly, when Jacob returns from 20 years, some say 40 years, in the land of Aram, with his large family now and independently wealthy, he was dead scared, wasn't he, about coming face to face with Esau again. You know, sort of perhaps have this picture of Jacob, you know, with his knapsack and his stick going off for the big adventure. He actually calls it later on the day of his distress. And he was profoundly, he was deeply scared of Esau coming after him. He wasn't welcoming the chance to leave home and go off on the big adventure at all. He didn't want to go. And yet God looked after him in that foreign land and slowly but surely worked on his character to bring him in line with his own thinking and blessed him. And so when he came back, of course, he came back with all the blessings that God had given him, but he's still unresolved, this conflict with Esau and his guilty conscience for what had happened so many years before. And we can see him, what can't we? We can be praying and torturing himself and trying to come up with plans and doing everything to do what he can to face this crisis, this confrontation with Esau in Genesis chapters 32 and 33. Ultimately, when they come face to face, Esau throws his arms around him, gives him a big kiss and urges him to come on down and see what he's been doing in the land of Edom. So Esau had long since moved on. You know, he was getting what he wanted in this life, and his bruised ego about the promises, you know, that had long since healed, and he was happy to move on. And we see Jacob carefully sort of steering himself away from Esau because he clearly didn't quite trust him. But it seems to me that ultimately the two brothers found some kind of reconciliation and living agreement. There's no evidence of an ongoing enmity or bitterness between the two of them after that moment. Now, the nations moved in two different directions. Jacob went down to Egypt, and Esau and his descendants continued to carve out a kingdom in the mountains of Edom. And about 500 years later, when Israel came back through the wilderness en route to Canaan, Edom denied Israel passage. So the nations had grown apart. And the fact that they had been twin brothers and were very, very close culturally no longer mattered. And Edom, well, it didn't come to blows, but Edom certainly wasn't going to give Israel any kind of passage through their land. They didn't trust them, and they weren't prepared to do them a favour. Well, it was sort of left there. Deuteronomy tells Israel, you've got to respect Edom as a brother and let them worship if they want to, and you're not to trespass on their land. So from God's point of view, he just instructed Israel really to remain open-minded and leave them alone. And by around the 1000 mark, we've got Edomites even serving in Saul's civil service. Doeg, the Edomite. But of course, he massacred the priests. And whether that led to the next event, a few years later when David became king, Joab devastated Edom, we don't really know what lay behind that. But this conflict here, this sort of butchery that clearly went on in the land of Edom, for whatever reason, really triggered then a very poisonous relationship between the two nations from that point onward. And the rest of the history, if you like, of Kings and Chronicles really seems to be a record of, you know, when Edom was strong enough, they sort of broke away. When Israel was strong enough, they sort of came back and smashed them again. And so there's this terrible sort of punch and counterpunch going on all the way through the monarchy, the two kingdoms. So in 990, Joab devastated Edom. Rough, these dates are rough. 845, Edom gained its freedom from Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. About, 65 years later, Amaziah devastated Edom, and that's the time where he sort of, you know, threw, I think, 10,000 people, it says, off the rock Selah. So it was very brutal, horrendous, really, war crime, we call it today. 587, the Edomites were supporting the Babylonians when they captured Jerusalem, and they were right on board. So Psalms and Lamentations talk about the fact the Edomites were thrilled. You know, they really gloated at the devastation of Judah and Jerusalem, and that perhaps is the background to Obadiah's commentary in his prophecy. So that brings us to the fall of Jerusalem. Just to finish off the story, not long after, so that's 587, about 30 to 40 years later, the last king of Babylon actually defeated Edom. So they sort of got what Judah had got about 40 years before. But in Malachi, he talks about the fact the Edomites were very resilient. They were determined to rebuild. You know, we might have been wasted, but we're going to go back and rebuild those towns and villages and get our kingdom up and off the ground again. And he contrasts that really unfavourably with Judah's apathy and sort of self-indulgent whinging, really. You know, God doesn't love us, he's not doing anything for us, life is tough. He said, well, the Edomites are not acting like that, and yet I love Jacob and I hated Esau. So how about a change of attitude? So by 312 BC, we don't really know what happened in here, but the Edomite nation really just fell apart, and nobody quite knows why that happened. The Edomites themselves moved into southern Judea, and the Nabateans, who were like desert Arabs, they possessed, we find them in possession of Petra when Alexander the Great comes through. So whether they pushed the Edomites out or the Edomites moved out, left a vacuum and they moved in, we don't know. But if you see photographs of Petra today, and it's quite magnificent apparently, I've only ever seen it in photographs, all of that is really Nabatean. It's not Edomite at all. It's a different nation, an Arab nation that came in after the Edomites and took over their lands and built their own kingdom there. In 162 BC, the Edomites were forcibly converted to Judaism by the Maccabees. Herod the Great, so-called, became a king of Judea. He was an Idumean. So they were really on top at that stage, weren't they? But 30 years, that's 40 BC, so 110 years later though, the Idumeans joined the Jewish revolt against Rome. And of course, that was, in the end, it was a crushing victory on the part of the Romans. And from that point, there's no more talk of Idumeans anywhere. They just disappear really into history. So that's just a bit of a brief overview of the history of Edom. And it's a history of constant conflict between the two nations. And perhaps it's this event here, the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, that really triggered Obadiah's words in his prophecy. Now, I'm having trouble reading that clock, I must say. My eyesight's not as good as it should be. So is that saying nearly 6:30? Okay, good. I'll track that and we'll have a hymn shortly. So what is it then that Obadiah sort of speaks of in his prophecy against Edom? Well, first of all, he talks about Edom's pride, doesn't he? Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom, we have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So pride is the big thing that Obadiah opens with, and it's Edom's pride that God is going to judge And he speaks here, it doesn't matter, how confident or how remote their dwellings, he will ensure that the nations round about come in and judge Edom for their pride. So this is a golden eagle. They're common in that part of the world, and that's what God's referring to. And the Edomites really thought of themselves like this. In fact, this is an interesting thing I found when I was sort of researching for tonight. This is a sort of a cartoon, if you like, of a golden eagle on the side of a wall in one of the villages in Edom. And it's in the black, green and red, which are like the national colours, if you like, of the Kingdom of Jordan. The eagle is their symbol, I suppose. And so even today, if you like, that kind of iconography is typical of the region, and it's reflected there in this, I guess it's like a political poster in Jordanian terms, sort of celebrating the royal Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and they use the eagle as their symbol. And God's saying, well, it doesn't matter, Edom, how remote or how high or how strongly you are fortified, I'm going to bring you down. Now, is it that God has a real thing about pride? Well, yes, but it's because of what pride does, isn't it? It's not pride in itself, and I'm not saying pride's a good thing, don't get me wrong, but pride manifests itself, doesn't it, in an attitude to God and an attitude to other people, and that's really, if you like, where the damage is done. So in 1 John, for example, he says pride is characteristic of our transient world. It's something that's just built into the way society thinks. And I think we see that in this current spat between the US and North Korea. It's classic, isn't it? The North Koreans responded by saying, you're crazy and you're got a megalomaniacal love of power. I thought it was probably true of both of them. But it's just so typical of people who rise to the top in our world today, or many of them anyway. And John says in 1 John 2, don't get sucked in by that kind of behaviour. It's just so common, it's so embedded in the way people are taught to push for achievement and success in every field of life. Don't become like that. And so he says in 1 John 2, do not love the world, all the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life. And the word is translated in other translations as vainglory, or the boasting of what a man has and does, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires and its pride, we might add. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. And so God has this thing about pride because of what it does to us. It perverts us and it corrupts our attitude to other people. When you see people treating others badly, and we'll get to that in just a moment in Obadiah, often there's a large measure of pride behind it. And in religious circles, like our own, for example, it's often manifested in things like self-righteousness, isn't it? And judgmentalism. I'm okay, I know what's right, my life's on track, my family's together, but you've got a problem. And there's pride behind that. When you think and speak of other people and you treat them like that, that's what's driving it. And that's what pride does. And so the first thing that Obadiah picks out, if you like, is this: the root of Edom's problem is their pride and their self-confidence, and that's what's driving this mistreatment of other people. Now, I quoted from Micah before. It's a great passage. In Micah chapter 6, the prophet runs a court case between God and his people, and Israel sort of almost throwing these questions at God. Well, what do you really want? Do you want thousands of sheep and goats as sacrifices? Do you want 10,000 rivers of oil? Do you want me to give my firstborn son for the sin of my soul? So this is Israel's attitude to God. What you want is extreme, God. You ask the unreasonable thing. And how can we possibly satisfy such a demanding and unreasonable God? That's Israel's attitude. And Micah says, well, he's told you what he wants, actually. And it's not that difficult at all. What he wants is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, I know there's times where we don't feel like being fair or kind or humble, but it's not such a hard thing to ask of anybody, is it? We don't feel that that's an unreasonable expectation on God's part, that he wants us to be fair, to be kind, and to be humble. That's really something that all of us can aspire to. And so those three key values, if you like, of the covenant, his expectations of his people Israel, Edom has grossly transgressed them, and God says, well, the inevitable must happen. Your pride will set you up for complacency. You will not see the signs in the nations around you of a changing attitude, perhaps, and all of a sudden, bang, catastrophe will come, and you will receive the reward of your pride. So I guess lesson number one for me from reading Obadiah was humility is very important to God. And we see here his attitude to one instance of where someone had got completely out of control in their view of themselves, and the results that would follow from that. So let's grab our hymn books, and we'll have hymn 314. Thanks, Joel. Thank you for that. One thing we have to remember, I think, is when we see there are all these celebrations, aren't there, of Israel's restoration and victory and blessing in the Old Testament. And what we need to remember, and we'll see this tonight clearly, is that that's only stage one in God's mind. He's going to work through that to bring that same victory and blessing to all the nations of the world. So we need to look for that perspective when we read the Old Testament prophets. It is there. Now let's come to the second point then that we can pick out of this one chapter, short book of Obadiah. In verse 10, Obadiah moves into a sort of a catalogue of crimes, if you like, because of the slaughter and the violence, said the New Revised Standard Version. In fact, that division of the verses is, I believe, correct. But in my ESV and perhaps in your translation as well, it's got slaughter attached to the end of verse 9, but a little detail. But slaughter and violence are the two sort of crimes, if you like, that Obadiah is laying at the feet of Edom. And it's particularly distressing because it was twin brother against twin brother. It's hard to think of a closer human relationship, isn't it? And yet that relationship was not honoured by either party. And again, they were, and I guess it started in a way with Esau and Jacob personally, but it's certainly true of the two nations, sort of slugging away at each other and scoring points. And here Obadiah, God will deal, of course, with Israel's crimes, but here Obadiah picks up on Edom's crimes. And he says, because of that slaughter and violence, Shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. And he goes on to list the actions that sort of highlighted for him sort of the really the terrible selfishness or self-concern of Edom and his hatred for his brother Jacob. They were so different, weren't they, in temperament, in spiritual outlook and destiny. And yet God said, before they were born, the older will serve the younger. And God's verdict, in Romans 9, Paul says, before the children were born, he said, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. So God made his choice, and of course it was vindicated by history. Esau wanted a kingdom in this world, and he was obviously an impressive leader and hunter. By the time Jacob had gathered his family, Esau had hundreds of men following him from a standing start, if you like. So Esau was clearly, in this world's terms, a powerful leader, and he was successful in what he set out to do, while Jacob was faithful to the tradition of his grandfather and his father. Now, we've looked a little bit about the history between the two nations, and what we want to focus on now is this sort of graphic picture that Obadiah paints of the reasons for God's intense hostility toward Edom. And it starts with an appalling attitude. Have a look at verse 11. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. So that's really where it began, with this terrible attitude of Edom's toward Jacob. And then he moves into appalling actions. And so from verses 12 to 14, there's a list of 8 things that for Obadiah sort of captured the enormity of Edom's attitude to his twin brother nation, if you like, Judah. And so in verse 12, for example, he had stood with foreign nations. You gloated over the day of your brother and the day of his misfortune. And so as they carried away his forces, there were the Edomites standing there gloating over this sort of come down on the part of Judah. And he moves through 8 such accusations over the course of those 3 verses. Now, in my ESV, and your translation might be similar, it says, do not. Who's got a similar thing in their translation? That's the ESV. Do not gloat, for example. Do not rejoice. Do not boast. Sort of commands, aren't they, or imperatives. You notice, what did, you had an NRSV, Daniel, how did that read? You should not. So it's sort of instruction, like this is a mistake, Edom. Don't do this. This is really what you should not do. So there's a range of different ways in which the verbs can be translated. It can be don't gloat or don't stop or stop gloating. It could be past tense. You shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't do it in the future. But really, it doesn't matter too much. Obadiah's focus is on what the actions were, and that's really where we want to spend our time now. So there's a progression in Edom's crimes. In verse 12, you'll notice there's 3 malicious looks and words. And that's the focus. There is a structure to this list. So in verse 12, 3 malicious looks and words: gloating, rejoicing, boasting. Right? This is language, isn't it? Okay, or attitude. In verse 13, we've got 3 acts of exploitation. So they entered the gates. They gloated over his disaster. They looted his wealth. And then in verse 14, we've got 2 acts of brutal violence. So cutting off the fugitives and handing over the survivors, presumably for slavery in the day of distress. So there's a structure to the list. It escalates, if you like. But it all begins from that initial attitude in verse 11 of standing aloof and standing with the enemy rather than standing with the brother. And that's how it works, isn't it? If there's violence in the heart, it gives birth to violent acts. And once Edom had stood aloof from his brother and disowned him and dissociated from him, the more aggressive acts became possible. And Obadiah condemns those crimes vehemently as their seriousness intensifies. So let's just have a quick look at the list and then draw some lessons from it. So in verse 12, he says, you gloated over Jacob's misfortune. The word means to feast the eyes on. They're looking hungrily and feeling delighted at what they're seeing as the drama of Judah's collapse unfolds before their eyes. You shouldn't rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin, says Obadiah. So they'd be delighted. They'd sung for joy when Judah had collapsed. And he says, you boasted in the day of distress. So speaking proudly, talking big, making the mouth large is the literal Hebrew. That sort of gives us a picture, if you like, of how the Edomites behaved in these three malicious looks and words that are recorded here in verse 12. In the day of your brother, he says. And so you think if there's a covenant tie or a relationship, then there's something even sort of more intense, you think, which is a blood tie. And yet Edom had not acknowledged that at all. She'd broken that tie and betrayed her blood ties with her brother here in verse 12. So it gets worse. In verse 13, we've got 3 acts of callous exploitation. So Edom had entered the gates of Judah, right? Either taking an active role in capturing Jerusalem or riding on the coattails of those who'd done so and participating in control of the captured city. And gloated over his disaster in the day of his calamity. So it means to inspect the disaster, to walk the streets, delighted in the spectacle of humiliation and desolation. And then finally, looting his wealth in the day of his calamity. So they hadn't been able to resist the temptation to reach out and comb over the ruins and snatch their share of the plunder with their own hands. So it got pretty bad, hadn't it? And then in verse 14, 2 acts of brutal violence. Edom had stood at the crossroads, at the road junctions, to intercept and butcher the fugitives from Judah. And they'd also delivered up or handed over the survivors for slavery or death. And so their betrayal of this brotherly relationship was complete. So it's worth pausing at this point to consider how Edom should have behaved toward his brother, because again, we can flip the coin and look at, well, what should have happened? The first thing, where it begins in verse 11, is identifying with the brother, isn't it? So Edom had made a choice to stand aloof, to stand apart, to stand with the enemy, and that had been where their crimes had begun. And if he'd identified with his brother, of course, he wouldn't have gone down that track. Everything else follows from that. And I think of examples, like take an extreme example of Nazi Germany. How did they begin to bring a apparently civilised Western nation, very high standards of education? How did they bring them to a point where they were prepared to treat Jews like vermin and stamp them out? Well, they began by dehumanising them and alienating them, didn't they? They started talking about the hidden threat to the economy. They picked out perhaps examples of Jews who'd abused their position, and slowly but surely they ate away at the humanity of the Jewish people in their midst. I remember reading about, I think it was Goebbels, that they had to really deal with this instinct in many Germans to say, well, hang on, I know lots of Jews and they're good people. And they actually addressed that explicitly. They said, don't give me your example of a good Jew. I could give you my example of a good Jew, but unless we stamp them all out, the problem will persist. They actually had to tackle that because lots of Germans instinctively reacted against this, and they consciously fought to overcome that natural attraction to the good Jew, as they called it. And only when they'd finally reduced them to a level of essentially being animals, that's when they could really bring the whole nation on board with their program of extermination. Interestingly, exactly the same thing's going on in Burma at the moment. So I was listening to it's a guy who was an expert in Myanmar, and he was saying that the extreme version of Buddhism that is practiced in Myanmar, Theravada Buddhism, actually sees the Rohingyas as reincarnations of snakes and mice and spiders, so vermin. And because they think of them in that way, it's much easier to treat them in the way they're doing at the moment. So we can probably find many examples of that through history, and it illustrates, doesn't it, that once we start to see people as less than ourselves, as not really deserving of humane treatment, then anything is possible. And there's plenty of examples of that through history. And so the first thing we need to learn from the way the Edomites behaved is to fight our natural tendency to set ourselves over against other people until we can become like Paul, who said, I made all things to all men. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. To the Gentiles, I became as a Gentile. To them under the law, as one under the law. To them without the law, as one without the law. He found every possible way to relate to people and identify with them and understand them, and that's how he could reach them with the gospel and pass to them. So there's this way in which people behave, and and it's illustrated here in Edom's behaviour, and we've got to say, no, I'm going totally the opposite direction here. I want to find every possible way to connect with my fellow human beings and identify with them and stand with them and sympathise with them and show them, work out in myself, in my attitudes to them and my actions toward them, how Christ would behave. And if we take each of these statements individually, we can start to build a picture of what brotherly behaviour looks like. So if, for example, instead of looking on maliciously and gleefully as Edom did, what would be the opposite of that? Well, I've tried to think about this, and you might be able to come up with better ways of flipping the coin, if you like, but this is my attempt. So I thought, well, love really wouldn't look on maliciously and gleefully. What would it do instead? It would seek to cover the multitude of sins. Now, we have to be clear here. Of course, we don't mean cover up, do we? When we say cover the multitude of sins, we're using that Old Testament concept of atonement or covering, where we're really looking to reach out and to address the problem of sin and help that person overcome it. And James talks about the virtue of that, and Peter uses the same language in 1 Peter chapter 3. That's what we need to do. So instead of sort of standing back and following and saying, well, look at that. You know, what we really should be doing is trying to step into the situation, find a way to connect with people and help them deal with the sins that have come through in that situation. What about instead of rejoicing in Jacob's ruin as Edom did? Well, we should be sharing people's devastation, shouldn't we? The Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 12, you need to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so we need to find ways to connect emotionally with people who are going through situations perhaps of their own making, right? Judah was at fault here. Judah had ignored the prophets and the judgments of God had fallen, but that's still no excuse for Edom to stand back and rejoice in ruin, right? This wasn't a godly judgment. It was a carnal reaction to someone who'd been taken down by God. That's not how we should think and act. Talking about Jacob long and loud, boasting, Obadiah calls it. Well, what would be the reverse of that? Well, I thought maybe it's praying humbly for the fallen. In Galatians 6, Paul says, restoring such a one in a spirit of meekness, being aware of the fact that you're human too and you could be overtaken in a fault. So that's where humility again plays an important role. In Romans 11 he says, doesn't he, don't boast against the branches. God's judgments fell on Israel. They could fall on you if you fell into the same attitude. So you're not immune from his judgments, but you should have a humble attitude toward his people. So let's keep thinking about this. Instead of callously taking advantage of the situation in verse 13 and entering the gate of my people and in the end predating, what should we do? Well, we should be looking to support the spiritual warfare of our brothers and sisters, shouldn't we? We should be saying, I see a bit of weakness here. I'm not going to stand back and criticise that. I'm not going to sort of make a thing of it in my teaching somewhere else or make a point about that ecclesia or that family or that person. I'm going to get involved. I'm going to help strengthen them spiritually and lift up the hands that hang down and strengthen the feeble knees. That's what brotherly action involves, and that's what we need to do. Looking over Judah's substance. Well, let's resist any impulse to take advantage of spiritual disaster in any way. In Psalm 40, the psalmist talks about the fact that his enemies are treating him despicably, but when they were down, that wasn't his attitude. He was praying for them, he was working for them to rescue them out of that situation. That needs to be our attitude as well. Instead of joining in the looting as Edom did, of course, we should be looking to provide material support, the practical, concrete expression of our love. And finally, Edom was guilty of brutally killing the fugitives and handing over the survivors as slaves. But of course, our attitude must be the very reverse of that. We've got to look for simple, practical ways to give refuge. Right, a shirt for the naked back, a visit in hospital or in prison, a room for the night, food. That's what we need to do. Simple, everyday, practical support for people going through a crisis. And ultimately, of course, our goal is to work to save them and to free the slaves. In 2 Timothy 2, there's probably better passages, but the one that came to my mind was at the end of 2 Timothy 2, Paul, at the end of his life, is talking to Timothy about how to handle the problems of wrong teaching. And he doesn't actually get very excited and aggressive about it. He says, Timothy, ultimately the real answer is just patient teaching. Just keep chipping away, keep saying what's right, keep reaching out to those people. That's what the servant of the Lord has to do. And it just might be that if you maintain that persistent and patient approach, one day you might get through. And you might rescue those who've fallen into the snare of the devil and are held captive by him. So that's what we've got to do, that kind of attitude. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised that these were characteristic of the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So he stepped into our human situation voluntarily to save sinners. At his baptism, he took on that mission that God held out to him and he embraced it, knowing what was involved. He said, I'm going to identify with them. So just as we identified with him in baptism, he identified with us, knowing what it would mean for him. For all the trouble the Jewish authorities gave him, as he comes to Jerusalem with days to go, knowing what's going to happen there, that Passover, comes over the brow of the hill and he looks down at Jerusalem, the temple, and he bursts into tears. Because he's not delighted at all about what's going to happen to that people because of their rejection of him. We don't see him standing back and remaining aloof from us, do we? He's not ashamed to call them brethren, says the writer to the Hebrews. He's a merciful and faithful priest who gets involved in our situation even now and does what he can to help us. He gave himself the just for the unjust to bring us to God. And of course, in bringing the good news of God's salvation to the world, as he says in Isaiah 61, he's breaking prisons open. He's giving sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf. That is his goal and his mission. And if we can only take on board his spirit, the greatest of men and yet the humblest of men, and work that out in a spirit of love, practically, when people fall into spiritual catastrophe or crisis, we won't come under the condemnation of Obadiah, but we will in fact do what we can to play a constructive role in that situation. Now, just a couple more things from Obadiah. Of course, he goes on to speak about the day of the Lord upon all nations, when those who have done will have it done to them. There's a poetry about God's justice. He talks about the restoration of Israel, and there's some fascinating things that he has to say about that. But I just want to finish on one last point, which is, I mentioned that Obadiah finishes, or the story finishes, if you like, with forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, it doesn't really sound like that, does it? If you just come to verse 21, the very last, well, actually, let's a little bit further back. If we come to verse 18 of Obadiah, it's sounding pretty ferocious at that point, isn't it? The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. And so it's the picture of a racing grass fire. That's what's going to happen as the Jews come back and they build critical mass and God's blessing is on them. Wow, Edom, are you really going to feel it? They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Now, I think if you were saying to Obadiah, no, I want you to be a bit more absolute there. Right? You couldn't do it, could you, right? There shall be no survivor. How definite is that? Well, as always, there's a law and grace thing going on here. And even though that sounds so definite and so final, that's not how God works at all, is it? There's always a remnant by grace. And my favourite example, of course, is Rahab. How many times in the law of Moses did God say to Israel, when you go into that land, what you must do is wipe out the Canaanites. Don't omit to wipe out the Canaanites. Don't marry them, don't do deals with them, destroy their places of worship, get them out of the land by any means, fair or foul, and that's what I want. They're not even in the land. 2 spies swim the Jordan, and the very first Canaanite they meet is saved, and with all her house. And it says when they brought out, it says they brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her sisters and her brothers and all that she had. So her house was packed to the rafters with people who'd brought her story about the God of Israel and his promises, and his purpose with Israel and their only hope of salvation, and whoever had listened to her was packed into that house and they were saved, despite what God had said. So that, to me, seems to be a pattern in how God works. We actually see it here as well. So just quickly, let me outline this for you. We've got Obadiah's point, but just come over to Amos. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. So it's really just back a page. You'll see in verse 11 of Obadiah, verse 11 of Amos, he says, "In that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this." So again, it sounds like Israelite triumphalism, doesn't it? But it's not. We've got to read it carefully. See that little phrase there, all the nations who are called by my name. And anyway, why are we talking about a remnant of Edom? Because there shall be no survivors, said Obadiah. Maybe there are. This is Amos 9. Sorry. Yeah, just the page before. So verse 11 and verse 12, Amos, as do many of the prophets, talks about God's judgments on Edom, and he finishes in verse 12 by saying that they may possess the remnant of Edom. Now, there should be no remnant, should there? Right? Because there's supposed to be no survivors. There's a remnant. Why? That's the term, isn't it? The classic term that God uses are those saved by grace throughout the prophets. And so even from Edom, there is a remnant. And all the nations who are called by my name. So these are nations who worship and who are identified with the God of Israel, declares the Lord who does this. Now have a look how that passage is picked up. Just come over to our last quotation here in Acts 15. Look at how James, obviously a very thoughtful, very well-read Bible student and a very thoughtful person, he thought carefully about this passage, and he says, this is telling us something pretty important that guides us in our attitude to all of these Gentiles who are pouring into the ecclesia today. So at the Jerusalem Council, when of course there's this big debate, do you have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses, or can Gentiles be saved without that? And there's sort of strong points of view on both sides. Of course, we know who was right. But look at how James approaches it here. Verse 13 of Acts chapter 15. After they all finished speaking, James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simeon," that is Simon Peter, "has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name." And so you see, James picks up on that little phrase in Amos, all the nations who are called by my name. And he says, that means, that means that God will have a people for his name, including the nations, the Gentiles, a remnant of Edom. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written. And he goes on to quote Amos. "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, that the remnant of mankind," that's the little phrase that's translated the remnant of Edom in Amos. So it's playing on the sort of the meaning of Edom, Adam, a man. And it's interpreted here, the remnant of mankind is generalising from this promise for Edom to everybody. "May seek the Lord and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old." And then he goes on to give his counsel that will ensure that the Gentiles can participate freely and fully in the new life in Christ. And of course, we are the beneficiaries of that, even though these events are so long ago, they really set the scene for our inclusion in the hope of Israel. So it's wonderful, isn't it, how that even such an absolute statement as Obadiah appears to finish with is once we start to read it in the broader context of Scripture, and we see what Amos has to say, we see what James does with that here in Acts chapter 15, we realise that God is consistent. And he lays down these laws which are based on standards, clear standards of right and wrong. And yet people who will turn to him in faith will find grace from him and be saved, even if in terms of the law, they find themselves on the wrong side of it, as Rahab did and as Edom did. He is a just God and a saviour, as he told Isaiah. And he's always ready, willing and eager to embrace those who turn to him. So there are the 5 key lessons, if you like, that I learned from Obadiah, and I hope they've been of interest to you tonight. First of all, pride. It vaunts itself against other people. It informed Edom's attitude and actions toward Israel, and instead God calls for justice, mercy and humility. Am I my brother's keeper? Obadiah would say, absolutely yes. And we have to learn from Edom's terrible actions here to deal in a positive sense with those around us and play a constructive role in spiritual catastrophe and failure. The day of the Lord is coming, and that will also mean the restoration and the blessing of Israel. But even for Edom, there is an opportunity here. And when he talks about saviours coming up on Mount Zion and judging the mountains of Esau, once we interpret that in the broader context of the prophets, we can see that God is also envisaging the conversion of Edom, the forgiveness of Edom, and the reconciliation perhaps of Edom and Israel, of Esau and Jacob as the descendants of Abraham in Jesus Christ the Saviour. And so there is perhaps, after all, a lot to learn from Obadiah the Obscure.